David Chen sat across from the young waitress in a small corner cafe, watching her refill his coffee with hands that moved with unexpected grace. And he felt something stir in his chest that he couldn't quite name, a strange familiarity. A whisper of recognition, but he pushed it aside because in 3 days, he was supposed to meet his fiancée for the first time in 12 years. The daughter of billionaire Robert Morrison, and his mind was already rehearsing what to say to someone he'd been arranged to marry since childhood but barely remembered. He'd been in Riverside City for 2 weeks now, staying at the Grand Hotel, preparing for the merger between his family's investment firm and the Morrison empire. And every morning he came to this modest cafe called Lily's Corner because it reminded him of simpler times, before expectations and portfolios and board meetings consumed his life. And every morning the same waitress served him a young woman with kind eyes the color of warm honey, dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a faded apron over jeans and a white shirt, her smile genuine in a way that made his carefully constructed professional walls feel thin and unnecessary. "Rough morning?" she asked softly, noticing the tension in his shoulders, and he looked up. Really looked at her for the first time in the 7 days she'd been serving him, and felt that tug again, that sense of something important just beyond his grasp. "Just thinking about the future," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty, because he never opened up to strangers, but something about her made him feel safe. "Is it the future you want, or the future someone else wants for you?" she asked, her voice gentle but direct. And the question hit him like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples through assumptions he'd never questioned. He paused, his prepared answer dying on his lips. Because the truth was, he didn't know any more. The engagement to Alina Morrison had been decided when they were children, when his family and hers had forged an alliance that made sense on paper, in spreadsheets and contracts, but he couldn't remember her face. Only a hazy memory of a quiet girl with sad eyes at his 10th birthday party, before her family's wealth exploded and his family's business struggles began. "I don't think anyone's asked me that before," he said quietly, and she smiled, a knowing smile that seemed to carry years of understanding. "Sometimes the most important questions are the ones nobody asks," she replied, and then another customer called for her attention, and she moved away, leaving him staring into his coffee, his reflection dark and uncertain in the liquid surface. Over the next 3 days, David found himself coming back not just for the coffee, but for the conversations, brief moments between her serving, other tables when she would pause by his seat near the window, and they would talk about dreams deferred and paths not taken, about the weight of family expectations and the cost of duty. And he learned her name was Ellie, that she'd been working at the cafe for 3 months, that she'd grown up privileged, but felt disconnected from that world, though she never specified how privileged. And he found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, about how he'd wanted to be an architect, but became a businessman instead, how he'd once believed in love, but had accepted arrangement as practical, how he was about to meet a woman he was supposed to marry, but couldn't remember. And Ellie listened with those honey-colored eyes that seemed to see straight through to his hidden heart. And once she said something that stopped him cold. "Maybe she doesn't remember you either. Maybe she's just as scared. Maybe you're both prisoners of other people's plans." The words haunted him because they suggested a possibility he'd never considered, that Alina Morrison might be just as trapped as he was. That behind the billionaire's daughter image, there might be a real person with real fears, but he'd been so focused on his own reluctance that he'd turned her into a symbol, rather than a human being. On the morning of the day he was supposed to finally meet his fiancée at the Morrison estate, he came to the cafe earlier than usual, and Ellie was there, wiping down tables in the empty morning light. And when she saw him, she smiled, but there was something sad in it, something final. "Big day," she said, not a question, and he nodded, feeling a weight in his chest he couldn't explain. "I don't want to go," he admitted, the words raw and true, and she came to sit across from him. her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. And for a long moment, they just sat in the golden morning light streaming through the cafe windows. To people on the edge of something neither could name. "Can I tell you a story?" she asked, and he nodded, desperate for anything that would delay the inevitable. "When I was 14, my mother died," she began, her voice soft but steady, "and my father threw himself into his work, building an empire, making billions, thinking money could fill the hole she left. And I became the billionaire's daughter, photographed and scrutinized and valued for my last name instead of my soul. And every person who came into my life wanted something: access, status, money, connection, and I forgot what it felt like to be seen as just a person. Just Ellie, not Alina Morrison, not an asset or a opportunity. Just me." David felt the world tilt, the pieces clicking into place with a force that took his breath, the familiar eyes, the knowing questions, the way she understood his struggle with expectation and duty. The name Ellie, which could easily be short for Alina. "You, ... he started, his voice breaking, and she met his gaze steadily, tears shining in her eyes, but her chin lifted with quiet courage. "I took this job 3 months ago, because I needed to know what it felt like to be normal, to be valued for my work instead of my inheritance, to have conversations where people didn't want anything from me," she continued, her hands trembling slightly around the mug. "And then you walked in, David Chen, the man I was supposed to marry. The boy I remembered from that birthday party 12 years ago, when you shared your cake with me even though the other kids said I was weird for bringing a book to a party. And you didn't recognize me, and I realized you didn't remember. And I thought maybe, just maybe, I could get to know you as people, not as arrangements." The cafe seemed to hold its breath, dust motes floating in the sunlight between them, and David felt 12 years of assumptions crumbling, because the woman across from him wasn't the shallow society figure he'd imagined. She was Ellie, who listened and understood and asked the questions that mattered. And she was Alina Morrison, who had disguised herself as a waitress to find authenticity in a world of facades. And she was the quiet girl who'd loved books at a party full of noise. And he realized, with a force that made his hands shake, that he'd fallen for her without knowing who she was, which meant he'd fallen for who she really was beneath all the labels and expectations. "You remembered?" he whispered. "The birthday party? The cake?" And she nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "You were kind when kindness wasn't required," she said simply, "and I've carried that memory for 12 years, hoping the boy who shared his cake might still exist inside the businessman. But I had to know. I had to see if you could see me, the real me, without the money and the name." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, feeling the calluses she'd earned from 3 months of honest work, and the gesture felt more intimate than any corporate handshake or formal greeting could ever be. "I've been so stupid," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "so focused on resenting an arrangement that I never considered the person. And I came here every morning because something about you felt like home, felt real in a way nothing in my life has felt real in years, and I was falling for you, Ellie, for the waitress who asked hard questions and listened to my dreams. And now you're telling me you're also Alina. And I'm terrified because I don't know how to hold both truths at once." She turned her hand in his, their palms pressing together, and said, "They're not different truths, David. They're the same truth. I'm both and neither. I'm just a person trying to find her way, just like you're not just a businessman. You're also the boy who wanted to design buildings and create beauty, and maybe we're both more than the boxes other people put us in." The cafe owner, an elderly woman named Lily, who'd known Elena's secret from the beginning, appeared with 2 plates of fresh pastries, set them down with a knowing smile, and disappeared back into the kitchen, giving them space for this moment that would define everything that came after. They talked for 2 hours, the morning stretching around them like a gift, and Alina told him everything, how her father, Robert Morrison, had built his fortune in technology and real estate, how the arranged marriage had been his way of securing legacy and alliance, but also how he'd told her just last week that he'd release her from the obligation if she truly didn't want it, because losing her mother had taught him that love mattered more than deals. Though he'd learned that lesson almost too late. He's not the tyrant I thought he was, David admitted, and I'm not the victim. I've been pretending to be. Could have said no, could have fought for my own path, but it was easier to blame the arrangement than to take responsibility for my own choices. Alina squeezed his hand, understanding in her eyes, and told him how working at the cafe had changed her, how learning to serve others, instead of being served, had taught her about dignity and worth, how her coworker Maria, a single mother working 2 jobs, had shown her what real strength looked like, how customers who left generous tips despite having little themselves had demonstrated a kindness that her wealthy social circle never had, and how she'd discovered that wealth wasn't in bank accounts but in genuine human connection. I don't want to go back to that world, she confessed, fresh tears streaming down her face. I don't want to be the billionaire's daughter in a glass tower. I want to be someone who matters because of what I do, not what I have. David felt something shift in his chest, a door opening to possibilities he'd never considered, and he said, "What if you didn't have to choose? What if you could be both Alina, who uses her resources to create good, and Ellie, who remembers what it's like to work for minimum wage and be dismissed by people who think service work is beneath them?" He paused, remembering with shame how he'd barely noticed her those first few days, how he'd been polite but distant, treating her as function rather than person, and he added, "You've taught me something crucial, that every person has infinite worth regardless of their job or status, and I've been so wrong, so blind to the humanity right in front of me." She smiled through her tears, and in that smile he saw his future, not as obligation but as choice, as possibility, as the kind of partnership where both people saw each other fully and chose each other daily. "There's supposed to be a formal meeting today," Alina said softly, glancing at the clock on the cafe wall, "at my father's estate, where David Chen meets Alina Morrison for the first time, where our families finalize the engagement, and I'm supposed to be there in 2 hours, wearing a designer dress and perfect makeup, playing the role of the billionaire's daughter." David nodded slowly, an idea forming, reckless and right in equal measure. And David Chen is supposed to arrive in a car service, wearing his best suit, prepared to meet his obligation with professional courtesy and private resentment, he added, then paused, his heart pounding with the courage of honesty. But what if neither of them showed up? What if instead, Ellie, the waitress, and David, the coffee shop regular, went to meet Robert Morrison and told him the truth, that the arrangement accidentally worked, but not in the way anyone planned, that we found each other as people first, and that if we're going to build a life together, it has to be built on authenticity, not appearance. Elena's eyes widened, hope and fear warring in her expression, and she asked, "You want to go to my father in our cafe clothes, as ourselves, and tell him we choose each other but on our own terms?" David stood, still holding her hand, and pulled her gently to her feet, and said with a conviction that surprised him with its strength, "I want to go to your father and tell him that his daughter is the most extraordinary person I've ever met, that she's brave enough to work for minimum wage to understand the world, compassionate enough to listen to a stranger's struggles, and wise enough to ask the questions that change everything, and that, if he'll have me, I'd like to marry her not because our families arranged it, but because I can't imagine my life without her in it, and I want to build something real, together. Not a merger, but a partnership." Alina let out a sound between a laugh and a sob, and threw her arms around him, and he held her in the middle of the small cafe, breathing in the scent of coffee and hope, feeling her heart beat against his chest, and knowing that this moment, this choice, was the first truly honest thing he'd done in years. They drove to the Morrison estate in Elena's old car. She'd bought it herself with her waitress wages, refusing to use her trust fund for the purchase, and the contrast between the modest vehicle and the massive iron gates bearing the Morrison name was almost comical. But David felt no embarrassment, only clarity. The security guard recognized Elena, despite her casual clothes, and waved them through with a shocked expression. And they drove up the long, tree-lined driveway to a mansion that looked like something from a magazine, all glass and stone and deliberate beauty. But it was the rose garden that caught David's attention, a riot of color and life that spoke of someone who valued growth and care. Robert Morrison met them at the door himself, having been alerted by security, and his expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and then unexpectedly relief, as he took in his daughter in her cafe uniform and the young man beside her in jeans and a button-down shirt, their hands clasped together like a lifeline. "Elena," he said softly, his voice carrying notes of concern and love. "The guests are arriving in an hour. The caterers are setting up. Your stylist is waiting upstairs. What's going on?" Elena stepped forward, her chin lifted with the same quiet courage David had seen in the cafe, and said, "Dad, I need you to cancel it, all of it. Because the formal meeting isn't necessary anymore. David and I have already met. We've been meeting every morning for the past week at Lily's Corner. And I need to tell you something important." Robert Morrison, the billionaire who commanded boardrooms and closed deals worth billions, looked suddenly vulnerable, a father afraid of losing his daughter, and he gestured them inside to his private study, a room lined with books and photographs, including one of a younger Elena with her mother, both laughing in a garden. And David saw where Elena had learned to value authenticity over appearance. In that study, with afternoon light streaming through tall windows, Elena and David told the whole story: the cafe, the conversations, the gradual recognition, the choice to present themselves as they truly were, rather than as polished versions for family approval. And Robert Morrison listened, without interrupting, his expression unreadable, his hands folded on the desk that had seen 1,000 negotiations, but perhaps never one quite like this. When they finished, silence stretched for a long moment, and David felt Elena's hand tighten in his, both of them prepared for rejection, for anger, for the weight of disappointed expectations. But then Robert did something neither anticipated. He laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and delight, and said, "You worked at Lily's Corner for 3 months, and I never knew. I used to meet your mother there when we were dating, before the money, before all of this. And Lily was her best friend. I've been supporting that cafe anonymously for years because it reminds me of when life was simpler." Elena gasped, tears spilling over, and her father came around the desk to embrace her. And David watched, as years of distance dissolved in that hug, as a father and daughter found their way back to each other through shared memory and unexpected truth. "I thought I was protecting you," Robert said quietly, his hand gentle on Elena's hair, "arranging a marriage with a good family, ensuring your security. But really I was trying to control things, because I couldn't control losing your mother, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I made you feel like you had to run away to find yourself." Elena cried against her father's shoulder, and David felt his own eyes burn with tears, because this moment wasn't about him, but about healing that went deeper than any business arrangement. After a moment, Robert looked at David over his daughter's head and said, "And you came here in cafe clothes to tell a billionaire that you love his daughter on your own terms, knowing I could destroy your family's business with a phone call, and you did it anyway, because it was honest." David met his gaze steadily and replied, "Sir, the past week with Elias, taught me that integrity matters more than security, that seeing people truly matters more than seeing opportunities. And yes, I love your daughter, not because of who you are or what she stands to inherit, but because she asked me if I was living the future I wanted or the future someone else wanted, and that question changed everything. And she is the future I want. if she'll have me." Robert Morrison studied him for a long moment, and David saw the keen intelligence that had built an empire, but also something softer, something that looked like approval. And finally, the older man extended his hand and said, "The arrangement was made when you were children. A business decision I thought was prudent. But this what you two have found. This is what I had with Elena's mother, and I wouldn't dishonor her memory by standing in the way of real love." They shook hands, but then Robert pulled David into an unexpected embrace and whispered, "Take care of her. See her. Really see her always, because being seen is the greatest gift we can give each other." When he released David, he turned back to Elena and said, "I'm canceling the formal reception, sending the guests home with an explanation that the couple has decided on a private engagement instead, and I'm going to make some changes in my own life, because watching you choose authenticity over appearance has reminded me what your mother always said, that wealth means nothing if we lose ourselves to maintain it." Elena hugged her father again, and through tears she said, "I want to keep working at the cafe, at least for a while. And I want to use my trust fund to create a foundation that supports service workers' education grants, healthcare assistance, childcare subsidies, because Maria and the others taught me what resilience looks like, and I want to honor that." Robert nodded, pride shining in his eyes, and said, "Your mother would love that idea, and I'd like to help, if you'll let me be part of it." David watched this exchange, feeling the sacredness of being witness to reconciliation, and he made his own silent promise to never forget the lessons of Lily's Corner Cafe, to never stop seeing the humanity in every person regardless of their position or status, to build his life not on the scaffolding of others' expectations but on the foundation of his own values. The sun was setting by the time they left the study, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, and Robert insisted they stay for dinner, not a formal affair, but a simple meal he prepared himself in the enormous kitchen, revealing that he'd learned to cook after his wife died because it made him feel close to her. And the three of them sat at the kitchen island eating pasta and salad, talking and laughing like family, like people who'd found their way through pretense to truth. Elena told stories about her cafe customers, her father shared memories of her mother, and David talked about his dream of designing buildings that served communities rather than just making profit. And Robert surprised them both by offering to fund David's return to architecture school, not as charity, but as investment in the kind of future-focused, human-centered design the world needed. And David felt tears slip down his face because this man he'd thought of as an obstacle was offering him the gift of a deferred dream. Later, in the rose garden under emerging stars, Elena and David walked hand in hand among the flowers her mother had planted years ago. And Elena said softly, "I was so afraid today, afraid you'd be angry that I'd deceived you, afraid my father would be disappointed, afraid that honesty would cost me everything." David stopped, turning to face her in the garden that smelled of roses and possibility, and said, "Honesty gave us everything. It gave us the chance to know each other truly, to choose each other freely, and to build something real instead of something expected. And I'm grateful for your courage in creating that opportunity." She kissed him then, gentle and sure, a kiss that tasted of tears and hope. And he held her close, feeling the miracle of finding home in another person, of being seen and seeing in return, of love that grew from authenticity rather than arrangement. 6 months later, David stood in Lily's Corner Cafe, which Elena's foundation had helped renovate and expand while keeping its essential character, and he watched his fiancée, his true fiancée, chosen and choosing, serve coffee to customers who had no idea she was a billionaire's daughter, and didn't need to know because she was simply Ellie, good at her job and kind to everyone, and he felt his heart swell with love and respect. He'd re-enrolled in architecture school, working on designs for affordable community housing, and Elena split her time between the cafe and her foundation work, which had already helped 200 service workers access education and healthcare. And they were planning a wedding that would be small and genuine, focused on love rather than spectacle. And both their families had embraced this new direction with surprising enthusiasm. Robert Morrison had stepped back from some of his business obligations to focus on philanthropic work, often joining Alina at foundation events, and David's parents, initially confused by his rejection of the business world, had come to support his architectural dreams after seeing the light return to their son's eyes. As David sat at his usual table, Alina brought him coffee and sat across from him for a brief break, and they smiled at each other with the intimacy of people who'd found each other by accident and kept each other by choice. And she said, "Do you ever regret how we started? All the confusion and deception." He reached across the table, taking her hand, feeling the calluses that remained despite her reduced hours, evidence of her commitment to staying grounded in reality. And he said, "I regret nothing, because everything, every confused moment, every conversation, every revelation brought us here, to this truth, that we are not defined by our positions or possessions, but by our choices and character. And every day I choose you, Ellie, Alina, every version of you. And I choose the life we're building together, messy and authentic and real." The cafe filled with the gentle sounds of conversation and clinking cups, and outside the window, the city moved in its endless rhythm, full of people carrying their own stories of struggle and hope. And David thought about how easy it would have been to miss this, to walk through life seeing roles instead of humans, to accept arrangement instead of seeking authentic connection, to value appearance over substance. And he felt profound gratitude for the woman across from him who'd had the courage to work as a waitress to find truth, and for his own willingness to open his heart to a stranger in a cafe, and for the unexpected grace that had transformed obligation into love and arrangement into choice. Alina had to return to work, but before she left, she leaned over and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." And he whispered back, "Thank you for asking the hard questions." And in those exchanges they acknowledged the miracle of their finding each other, not as billionaire's daughter and businessman's son, not as arrangement and obligation, but as two souls seeking authenticity in a world of facades, and finding in each other the reflection of their truest selves. As she walked away to serve another table, her smile bright and genuine, David opened his sketchbook and began drawing a design for a community center with a cafe at its heart, a place where people from all walks of life could gather and be seen. And he knew that this life of purpose and love, of service and authenticity, of choosing each other and choosing to see the humanity in everyone, this was the future he wanted. And it was more beautiful than any arranged future could ever have been. The story that began with a man who didn't recognize his own fiancé had become a story about learning to truly see, about the courage to be authentic, about finding love in unexpected places, and about understanding that our worth is not in our wealth or status, but in our kindness, our integrity, and our willingness to see and be seen in all our imperfect, beautiful humanity. And as the sun set over Riverside City, David Chen closed his sketchbook and smiled, knowing that the greatest design he'd ever be part of was the life he and Alina were building together, a life where a waitress could be a billionaire's daughter, where a businessman could become an architect, where arrangements could become choices, and where two people who'd been taught to value appearance learned instead to value truth. And in that truth, they found everything they'd been searching for.